We're going to get started with our last panel today, and last but definitely not least, and the most, both in numbers, but I think in a lot of ways importance in terms of when we talk about the question of political discourse. A lot of it comes back to, I think, both positively and negatively, the attention gets drawn to traditional media. We've had some discussion about social media and the growing influence of that, but I think it's really important that we talk to the people and hear from the people that are covering it and the challenges that they face in trying to deal with this and help us to have a more civil discourse and an understanding about the difficult policy issues. And to moderate our session today is Dianne Bystrom, and Dianne is the director of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University. I'm glad to have another fellow regent with us here today. And Dianne has served as director of the center since July of 1996. She's a frequent commentator about political and women's issues for state, national, and international media, and is a contributor and is author of many books, but I would think mostly is an expert on women in politics and discourse and things that go along with that, and journalism in particular, in media and political discussion is her expertise. So with that, I will turn it over to Dianne to introduce our panel.
All right. Thanks, Pete. Well, thank you for bearing with us and being here on this final panel. What I'm going to do today is structure it so hopefully we have a lot of questions from the audience at the end. So the plan is I'm going to introduce everyone briefly on the panel. They're each going to then give a statement, no more than 3 minutes apiece. And all, as media people, we know that we can be very succinct, but they're going to get a brief statement on the topic of the panel, which is media coverage and the impact of political discourse. And then I have 3 questions prepared that I'm going to ask everybody. I'll ask at least 2 of them, but I'll be mindful to give you at least 30 minutes to ask your questions as well. So I want to again finish this up with a boom. You know, I was telling the panelists I've actually crossed out and changed my questions several times, having sat here for 2 days. So I'm hoping that some of the questions will help kind of wrap this up at the end. So what we have today with us, I'm going to introduce them from my right going on. This is Jeff Charis-Carlson. He is the opinion page editor of the Iowa Press Citizen here in Iowa City. He has worked to facilitate civil conversation about controversial topics in one of the most highly educated and overly opinionated communities in the nation. Now, I did not make that up. I got that from the bio. So all I would say, coming from Ames, Iowa, we're also highly educated, but not as highly opinionated. So I think that's the difference. Lyle Muller, actually next to him is Kathie Obradavich. So Kathie Obradavich has served as political editor of the Des Moines Register since 2003, which of course was right before the 2004 caucuses. And in 2009, she took over from David Yepsen, who many of you probably know, as the Register's political columnist. She's also developed a following for campaign coverage on Twitter. Sitting next to Kathie is Lyle Muller. He's the editor of the Gazette in eastern Iowa. Before becoming a newspaper reporter in 1980, he also was a broadcast news reporter for 7 years prior to that. Seated next to Lyle is Adam Sullivan. Adam is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Iowan, the student newspaper at the University of Iowa. He has been covering local and state politics for 5 years, however, also as a reporter for the Gazette, KCRG, and the Iowa Independent, which is the state's largest online news organization. And finally, we have Ed Tibbets. He's a political reporter for the Quad City Times. In his 22 years at the newspaper, he has covered political figures ranging from aldermen to presidential candidates, the latter primarily writing about the Iowa's First in the Nation caucuses. Now, I wanted to pull out a little bit about each person because they're all currently right now working in the traditional media of newspapers, which is actually how I started my career as well. But as you can see from the introductions that we do have experience with online publications. We've got Kathie, who has social media and Twitter. We have Adam, that's worked again for an online and Lyle, who's also worked for broadcast media. So even though they're all working for newspapers right now, they have a little bit broader range than that. So again, we're going to open up. Each panelist, starting with Jeff, are going to give 2 to 3 minutes of opening remarks, which will provide their personal statements on the impact of media coverage on political discourse. So we'll hope to wrap that up in 15 minutes. And Jeff.
That's a tall order, but here we go. As you said, I'm Jeff Charis-Carlson from the Iowa City Press-Citizen, and I know it's kind of archaic, but when I think of the media, I still think first of newspapers, and when I think of newspapers, I still think first in terms of print. And so when I think, well, what's our role, what's our civic engagement in this, and how we're supposed to be filling our job now on the American scene, I still think it's in terms of getting us on the same page. Now, I don't know if it's proper etymology or not, but for me, I like to invite that phrase not so much to say that it's going to get everybody to think the same thing. That's how a lot of people use that phrase. I think it's more like what happens on a good opinion page, on the good printed opinion page of a newspaper. How you get a lot of contrasting and divergent opinions side by side in letters and in columns, how they sometimes intersect into each other, how they sometimes almost burn right next to each other on the page, and how they become microcosms of the community in which that they're in. Now, I work very hard to get a variety of perspectives on my opinion page, especially perspectives that are very different than what our staff editorial is going to be. I take it a little personally when people suggest that we're trying to be unfair or trying to stifle other debate, because it doesn't make any sense to me why we would want to do that, because the page is much better when we have the widest variety of viewpoints as we can have. And I think that no matter if we're going online, if we're going in print, if we're going to a nonprofit model, if we're for-profit, if we're independently owned newspapers or corporate journalism, the goal is still the same, to get us on the same page. Even as we are moving away from newspapers and into information centers or other kind of bloodless buzzwords, the Society for Professional Journalists still holds that our number one responsibility is to seek the truth and to report it, and to give the widest variety of and to express the widest variety of human diversity as we can. And in doing that, we want to write something that people won't put down. We don't want to just write a bunch of facts and figures. We want to capture all the passion, poignancy that comes with acknowledging the humanity of other people. And while we're writing about people, we want to write something that forces our readers to understand the humanities of others, again, as part of what the Society of Professional Journalists calls for. And at times, if we're going to view our subjects or the people we're writing about as human beings, that means we can't be afraid to pull them off their pedestals if necessary. And if we're going to view them as human beings, it means that we have to sometimes tell them when they're wrong, when they're short-sighted, and when they're denying the humanity of other people. So we have to be out there calling people when we think what they're saying is wrong. Civility in this scene doesn't mean just mere politeness. It means being able to express the full idea and the full arguments of what you want to say. And it means primarily to be a good citizen and to hold people accountable for what they say. As journalists, we sometimes, if we're trying to be both purveyors of scandal and civility, we sometimes cross the lines, and we have to own up to that. But other times, if our passion is for, and I'm going to quote Michael Gartner here, if we have the passion for truth, for justice, for freedom, for fairness, for equality, then that's when the passion that we're expressing is pushing us in the right direction. And that's when, especially when everyone's disagreeing, we can work hard to get everybody on the same page. I think that was more than 3 minutes. Sorry.
Okay, Kathie? Okay, you're about to hear the difference between the University of Iowa and Iowa State. I don't know if you remember, there's a board game that came out a few years ago called Fact or Crap. And the idea was to hear a statement and you'd hold up a little card that says fact or crap. Well, as a journalist, it used to be that my role was sort of a purveyor, a gatekeeper, as you will. When I was looking at press releases from candidates, which normally would come off the fax machine back in those days, I would look at it and decide for myself whether that press release was fact or crap. And if it was crap, it would go into the round file, and no one would ever see it. That was the gatekeeper role. Now I can look at it, and it can be full of lies, innuendos, libel, whatever. And you guys have all seen it already because it's on the internet, it's been emailed to you, it's been tweeted, it's on the candidate's website, et cetera, et cetera. And so instead of me saying, oh, this is crap and throwing it in the round file, instead my role as a journalist should be to say, okay, now I'm going to put up my own blog, and hopefully I've built up some sort of reputation so that it's a credible blog, so that I can tell you, this is innuendo, this is unfair, this is untrue, here's why you should conclude that this is crap. And possibly tell, hopefully take the next step and tell the candidate to stop it, to take it down. And that's I think that's a different role, and I think it's a better role in a lot of ways. Now, I can't save you anymore from being exposed to this, but I can help you make sense of it for yourself. And in a lot of ways, I think that's a better role. I over the last 10 years, in particular, I feel like I have a lot better understanding of what readers are thinking about. It used to be that you'd write a story, you'd send it off, and unless you got 35 angry phone calls in the morning, which would be a bad day, a rare day, you didn't really know what people were thinking. Now, all you have to do is scroll to the end of your piece, and you can see all the comments at the end. And, they may not be reflective of what most people think. A lot of times they're reflective of what some parolee in his basement thinks. But literally, actually, we did trace some really trolly comments one time to a halfway house in Des Moines where all these guys were essentially spending their afternoons commenting on police stories. But you do have to weed out some of that stuff. But you do get, I think, more honest commentary, or more honest and more frequent and easier communication between the journalist and the reader. And so that, to me, is helpful. And it's also not so much one-way communication anymore than it's a conversation. And so I'm not unhappy about the role. It's a harder role, going from gatekeeper to being someone who's trying to provide context or a guide, perhaps. But I think it's probably a little bit better role.
I'm going to start by telling you how dogs in downtown Cedar Rapids at the farmers market relate to this topic. During commenting on a story in the Gazette about people bringing dogs downtown, one of the commenters started out by writing, "You walking piece of," and it's going to be on TV, so I can't tell you the S word that ends with T that he used. And so I've used that statement as sort of the emphasis for a blog that I wrote in June when we implemented new commenting rules at thegazette.com to try to regulate the types of behavior that we were seeing with our commenters. And what we were seeing was a lot of incivility, people calling each other names, straying off topic, and just absolutely doing anything but adding value to those stories. And so how it applies to this topic. When we talk about political discourse, we really want to have a wide variety of views. That's what makes the political process work, trying to get a wide variety of views. And in fact, some of it can be pretty critical, some of it can be pretty nasty. Politics can be a nasty game. And so the question for us as we monitor comments from the public is, how far do we go in defining civility? And I think that's a major issue now that exists in our industry, and one that we're wrestling with, because the fact is we want to add value to the discussion. We don't want to detract value. And so this week we've had a discussion on our website that I've tried to figure out, how do I deal with this, in which a commenter says all Republicans are evil. And so I thought, okay, and it's not Sue. And so I thought, how do I deal with this? But what I saw was the community itself started weighing in. And some people said, yeah, here's a list of things that they're doing that are wrong. Other people said, no, you're wrong. Here's the list of things that they've accomplished. And then some people who said, I'm a Democrat and I generally agree with you, but I got to tell you, I can't go out on a limb like you have by saying all Republicans are evil. And so the committee itself dictated how that discussion was going to go. The fact is that this kind of discourse has existed throughout American history. George Washington was accused of being a dictator and king-like, even though he tried to set himself up as not publicly. John Adams took abuse. Abraham Lincoln was called all sorts of vile names until he became sainted in death. And so this has been going on all the time. The thing is, we have different tools now. We have instant access to give voices to people. And so I think the big thing that we're trying to deal with as we allow public discourse about politics is, where do we draw the line, and is it fair to even say that a line ought to exist?
I think addressing the relationship that the media has with political discourse is extremely difficult because the two things are constituent of one another. Without a healthy press, you don't have any meaningful political discourse. And without meaningful political discourse, you don't have any media that's worthwhile. I think the biggest way in which technology has improved the relationship between media and political discourse is that it allows people like us to tune into those to political discourse between regular people much more easily. And so maybe it used to be the case that political discourse happened face-to-face, and now certainly that's still happening, but it's happening a lot more online, on comment message boards, on Twitter and Facebook, and that allows us to tune into that. And so rather than the parts of the political conversation that we're exposed to being only on opinions pages, now we're getting it from all over, and especially from people who might not even want it to get to us. You know, they're just talking on Twitter with their friends about politics. They're not trying to make a statement to the media, but we're still able to tune into that, and I think that enriches the way that we're able to cover political discourse.
Well, I come at this question from the perspective of simply being a reporter. The newspaper that I work at has a hierarchy that deals with these questions from a broader perspective. The editorial page editor, the editor-in-chief, try to do things in putting out a daily report that provides information, but also provides a place for what we hope would be fairly civil discourse. I look at things, as I say, in a little simpler, from a little simpler perspective, and that is simply I try to remind myself as a reporter, and I think it's probably true of the people that run my paper as well, that we're a community, and we are supposed to cover our communities. That means writing about what they do, what they say, and also asking those people to join in the conversation. It's obviously not always pretty, but as a reporter, I believe I can contribute to a more civil discourse by modeling behavior. It's a phrase that our editorial page editor uses every time he writes endorsement opinions. He'll say, we're not telling people how they should vote, we're telling them what we think, and we're trying to model a behavior of how to research issues and how to make smart decisions. And I think that from my own perspective, I think reporters serve themselves well when they try to do the same in researching and writing their stories, all the while keeping in mind that they're part of the community.
Thank you. We are under time limits there, so thank you for doing that. One of the things that, again, I think Pete alluded to this, but I started out my career as a political reporter for a newspaper in Nebraska, and then later on went to school and then now do most of my research on media coverage, primarily male versus female candidates, but also some other issues. But a lot of the things that we find in our research on political campaigns and media coverage of politics and political discourse is that traditional media devotes increasingly amounts of coverage to the horse race aspects of the campaign. And by that I mean who's ahead in the polls, the scandals, the political gaffes, campaign strategies, and less time to an emphasis of coverage on political issues, ideas, and policy. And then as part of that argument, it's been argued by researchers, again, who study this, that the emphasis on these horse race aspects of the campaign has a negative impact overall on political knowledge and political discourse. So I'd like, beginning with Ed, and we'll go to reverse order, do you agree that the traditional media, from your perspective, devotes too much coverage to the horse race aspects of the campaign? Kind of why or why not? And what the impact you believe traditional media coverage has on political discourse. So, Ed?
I think there is too much horse race journalism, but I think one of the reasons for that is there's so much more media. I'm not sure that traditional media is doing it any more than they have before. My preference is to write and to read stories about policy. But I confess I've certainly written my share about the horse race, and I think it's important too, particularly in a primary setting, where one of the things, say with the caucuses, that people have to consider is whether they're nominating an electable candidate. That in itself is a horse race question. So I don't think that you can get away with it, away from it. I do think we probably do too much of it, but I also see that traditional media, as well as other non-traditional media, are doing a lot more reporting and writing about issues, fact-checking. I think there is a ton of information out there about politics that goes beyond the horse race, and if people want to find it, they certainly can find it. Our challenge as traditional media is making what we produce the place where they want to find it.
I'm ill-equipped to talk about whether horse race journalism is increasing because I was born in the 1990s, and so I don't have as good a reference as any of the co-panelists. But just speaking in the last 6 or 7 years that I've been politically aware, I think there's entirely too much horse race journalism. I think, and you can see that perfectly. If there's a debate last night, and there were plenty of good issues talked about in the debate. There were policy proposals talked about. But what gets the most coverage this morning is that Rick Perry forgot one of the departments that he wants to cut. Obviously, that's a big gaffe that needs coverage. But does that deserve more coverage than the actual issues that were discussed? I think that's a perfect example of the media focusing too much on the political minutia and the game of politics, which is something that deserves coverage. It's a legitimate item to cover, but it shouldn't take precedence over covering the issues, and I think that's what goes on in a lot of media.
I think the lazy approach is reporting the horse race and leaving it at that. I think, though, the horse race can be very important when you're trying to determine trends and who is gaining traction with voters, and so there's some value there. And also, when we are doing this kind of reporting about the horse race, what we're really doing is reporting information that the campaigns, the political parties, and the candidates themselves are privy to, and the type of information that they're making decisions in their campaign because of. And so I think that's valuable reporting. I think the best use of the horse race reporting is a measurement of what's going on at a certain point in time, what type of issues are making that particular candidate strong at this point, and what type of trending can happen. I think that there is some value in that kind of reporting, but I myself, and I love politics, and I've covered it too before being an editor, that I do get annoyed after watching a political event, and immediately there are the instant polls telling you, who's resonating. I'm not, I'm interested in who's resonating, but I'm really more interested in why, and then what's going on with the electorate and how those candidates are connecting with the electorate.
couple of things that go on with the horse race coverage. First of all, we've got a 24-hour news cycle now, and I think that drives a lot of the horse race coverage. It's generally cheap. It lends itself to the sort of talking head model, which is what we see on a lot of cable news. And it's, there's a proliferation of polling. And so that kind of thing is, I think that's where you start getting an overemphasis on the horse race. But there's also a couple other things going on that I'll mention. We've got a primary campaign going on for president, okay? And regardless of, how the candidates stack up compared to what you think about issues, the candidates compared to each other, the differences are relatively subtle on issues. And so you have a situation where, you're plumbing a fairly narrow, you've got a shallow field of differences on actual differences, substantive differences between the candidates on issues. And so the differences come more in their backgrounds, their experience. What have they said? What have they done? How consistent have they been? And those are the kinds of things that end up becoming perhaps more than, fairly subtle differences in issues as people are choosing a candidate in a primary. I think it becomes a different equation in a general election. I'll mention too that, a lot of us in newspaper still cover campaigns like a newspaper, and that means that we cover the horse race until we judge that voters are actually paying attention, and that's when we throw out, we sort of regurgitate all of the issue grids and all that kind of stuff, and that's coming now. We haven't quite caught up to the notion that people are making their decisions in real time, and you should be putting up all those issue positions at the beginning of the race so that people can, and then keep refining them. We're not quite there yet in a lot of our coverage. Well, by the time we get to the general election, it'll all be there. But it used to be that you would wait until a month before the race, and then you start running all the issue stories so that people are actually making their decisions before they go to the polls. And we end up doing that still sometimes, even though we're in an internet age.
I'd just like to second that as I talk to people about what's the best thing that we can offer them for helping to make decisions in this, that it's the issue grids are what they always ask for. Some kind of clear distinction that we can provide that summarizes the difference between the candidates. And that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of planning for the editors and everyone to sit down and say, what are the key issues that we're going to be talking about? Dictated by the candidates, dictated by our readers, finding that negotiation. While those discussions are going on, the horse race approximates that discussion. There are times that we can focus, as Lyle was explaining, there are things to be learned from the horse race, from the decisions that are being made in the campaign, and it's the stories that our reporters can do until, as Kathie says, we're ready to move into that next phase of the issues-oriented. It's a good reminder that we should get into that phase more quickly than we have in the past.
And I think, again, two important things that I heard into takeaways, and when I teach my students in my political campaigns class, there's a lot of information out there. And to be clear, I think actually newspapers and news magazines, research again shows, do the best job of actually covering issues with the issue grids and the issue comparisons. But another thing that was said here, I think by Lyle, is that all that information is out there. Sometimes what you have to encourage, and some panelists in this conference have, is that you have to, as a consumer of news information, you have to do a little digging and not just open up one newspaper every day, not just go to one television show in the morning, that you really have to be an active consumer of political information to have that kind of process. So it's not just on the media. I want to leave with that. It's not just the media feeding it to you. It's you being able to be an active consumer. My next question has to do actually with a panel that some of us sat in on yesterday, and it was a panel on social media and political discourse. It was stated as part of this panel that the new media, including Facebook, Twitter, and blogs, had improved political discourse by broadening access to the discussion beyond what they called the gatekeepers of traditional media. One of the things I'd like to ask you about is, are there ways, and some of you have mentioned some ways, and most of these newspapers, by the way, have ways to blog and comment on stories, but do you think there's other ways in which traditional media can increase the diversity of coverage to enhance political discourse? Things that either your newspaper is doing, or you could even see other structural things within your newspaper that could increase the diversity of coverage. And this time we're going to start with Lyle, work this way, and then end up with Adam.
During the Cedar Rapids City Council election that we just went through, we actually had an exercise where, with the television station KCRG, which is owned by the same company that owns the Gazette, we had an exercise where we tried to figure out a new way of covering the City Council. And what we came up with was a whole bunch of ideas that I thought were good ideas, and one of them was to dedicate a reporter to simply covering these elections, and instead of just going out interviewing candidates, interviewing people, and then putting stories in the newspaper or on the website, actually get involved with a network of people online, even in person if necessary, and network with these folks with social media about issues that they were interested in, and then try to connect the dots with the types of things candidates were saying. And so that was a pretty progressive way of doing things. And what we found out the minute we tried doing that was how time intensive it was, and our insatiable appetite for all these other things we wanted the reporter to do. And so the whole idea collapsed. But it's still worth exploring. And so I've kept my notes, and I've talked with our managing editor Annette Schulte about it as well, that this is worthwhile. It's a new way of trying to do things. The fact is, people are learning their information from all sorts of different sources. We did a live chat during the Iowa Senate 18 races I was mentioning, and we had a number of people who were in there actually tweeting about us, what was being said in that live chat, also putting tweeted information in there. Iowa Independent was in there doing updates on the election. Another media, on our media, and they were a participant. It's a new world out there, and we were glad to have them. And so there are all sorts of different ways to spread this information. And by the way, in that live chat, we had people from both political parties, Brent Olson, a Republican supervisor from Marion, John Hedgecoth, who's done consulting for Democrats. They were in there, and they were giving perspective that really enriched that story.
Couple of things about social media. One, it can really enhance your reporting of candidates in ways that perhaps 5 years ago we wouldn't have even thought of. It's easier than ever to find people who are close to the candidates, use social media for source building. I think that when it comes to presidential politics, that in the 2008 cycle, it was widely seen that Barack Obama basically was the king of social media, and that Republicans could only hope to catch up with what he was doing on Facebook and Twitter. In 2010, the Republicans had caught up, but now they're looking at what is Barack Obama going to be doing in 2012, and in fact, what they believe he will be doing, and what they're hoping to catch up on is tying activity on social media then to action, tying it to donors. Tying people who go to the Facebook to get their email addresses, which then you can tie to donor pitches, and then their activity on donors. Suddenly you have a very big universe of information on the voters, and that is something that you can bet that the Republican candidates are looking at figuring out how to harness. I think Tim Pawlenty probably came the closest, but he couldn't sustain his operation, and now the guy who was doing his data is perhaps going to end up with somebody else. But so it's a fascinating thing. It can be very technical, and as a reporter, it's a very rich field. And so that you not only just what are voters saying about candidates, and there's lots of ways now that you can aggregate. I've heard people say that that Twitter traffic is actually going to be maybe more important than polling someday. I don't know if I could take it to that extent, but because you still have to talk to people who are not on Twitter, but I do think there's just a lot of really fascinating things that it opens up as far as political reporting is concerned.
as we're always using new media, trying to make the most out of our Facebook sites, trying to connect others, trying to help our employees learn where their professional presence and their personal presence blend as everybody's trying to use their own social media for that way. It does open up a number of options to hear people's own perspectives on the candidates. At the Press Citizen, we are always trying to focus more people on the online. We, of course, changing our comments options, trying to make that more accessible, trying to make that more open, as well as trying to use as many formats as we can. Most recently, we had a debate locally about some of our downtown business owners and near downtown business owners wanted to have the city council pass a self-sustained municipal improvement district. And one of the things that we were able to do is pull all the information from the petition and do a map of which property owners had signed on, which had not, and it tells a very different story than just the words itself to be able to express. If we can find those kind of creative ways, whether it's visual, whether it's online, it's always just the good journalism that's been done before, and always good journalists trying to find new ways to tell the story in a way that compels people to pay attention.
You know, there was a time when I probably would have said that question's not my problem. I'm just a reporter. I go out and write stories, and that if the newspaper wants to bring more diverse opinions into the newspaper, that's something my editor and the management should worry about. That's not the case anymore. I think that individual reporters and journalists are almost being asked, and probably would be wise, to assume the role of journalism entrepreneur. We are being asked, and I think it's a good thing too, to almost brand ourselves. And I think that by necessity that probably means interacting more with the public and drawing the public closer, and not only reporting on what they're saying and what they're doing, but making them a part of the process. That's very difficult to do, but I think it's becoming an imperative as social media becomes more the avenue that through which people get their news. And I'm almost 50 years old. I've been in this business for 25 years, and still struggle with the idea of how to do that. But it is necessary, both as an organization, as an industry, and I think as individuals, that we've got to learn how to do that.
My background is primarily in online media. I worked for an online news organization. When I worked for Lyle last semester, 75% of the things that I wrote never made it to print. They were only online. I'm always on Twitter and Facebook. But even with my background in all of those things, I don't think the next, what's hot right now, whether it's Twitter or whatever service is hot right now, however we're making it easy for people to reach out to us, matters that much. I think if you want to stir political discourse, you report new facts that are interesting, and people will talk. Whether they're talking on Twitter or Facebook or Tumblr, wherever they're talking, they're going to talk. And so in my newsroom, I leave it to the web people to come up with how are people going to interact with us? What website, what service are we going to use? I participate in those conversations, but my main priority is making sure that there are new and interesting things for people to talk about, because that stirs political discourse. But I also want to touch on what Ed had to say. I think because we're all on Twitter, we're all on Facebook, there are comments, our email addresses are all over. It's incumbent on us to be incredibly transparent and incredibly accessible, and I think Iowa journalists have done a good job of that. I think it's so easy for readers to reach out to us and say, I liked what you did here, I don't like what you did there. And I think we need to take all of that advice seriously and make sure that what we're doing not necessarily reflects how the majority of people would have it done, but that we're at least taking that input in when we're making editorial decisions.
We now are about at the mark where we have a half an hour left. I do have some more questions, but rather than go into those, I want to open it up to you. And then, like any good professor, if you don't ask questions, and then I'll either ask you to ask a question or I'll ask my own question. A takeaway, I think, from this also that's in this discussion, great plan, I think, by the Gazette on how to cover city council. And I've talked also to some reporters at the Des Moines Register who had these ideas on how they could open up access. But one of the things you hear here is that that type of non-traditional reporting takes time and hence money. And having been in that profession, and my brother who recently worked for the Argus News Leader, which is another Gazette publication, there's been a lot of layoffs in traditional media, and so again, struggling to do that. So let's open it up to questions. There's one here.
Well, I have a question. I don't think that the media is taking this presidential race seriously, because the United States president is not only the president of the United States, he's the king of the whole world. He can determine who lives, who dies. So we have Grover Norquist having the Republicans swear allegiance to him instead of the Constitution. That's the problem about Congress, that 112th Congress, the most corrupt Congress since Reconstruction. So why isn't the media delving down into this? And the Republicans seem to be, that are running, seem to belong in the 20th century, and we're in the 21st century where we have these drones flying all over the place, killing people in the Middle East and Asia. So, I mean, I think the media should take this presidential election seriously, because the Europeans did. This is why Obama got that Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't do anything to get it, but they were just so relieved to get rid of Bush. Speak on that, please.
Okay. And anybody can jump in any order.
I think it's a great question, but I think you're wrong to say that media is ignoring those issues. I think to some extent you're absolutely right that mainstream media, print publications, are not giving issues like you're talking about enough attention. But you still know about those issues because you have so many alternative sources of information at your fingertips. And so the non-print media, there are bloggers, there are independent bloggers, and both bloggers who work for news organizations. They are covering those things. And I think that we need to embrace that there are so many more sources of information at our fingertips, and the issues like those that maybe 50 years ago, if they weren't in a print publication, no one would have known about. A lot of people still know about these issues, even though they're not on the front pages of the major dailies.
If I might, I wouldn't agree with the contention that we aren't taking the election seriously. But I know that the opinion that you express is shared by a lot of people, and I think what it's incumbent upon us to do is figure out why that is, and not necessarily change what we're doing for change's sake, but figure out why that is, and that means talking to people who have that opinion and learning.
It's also interesting in Iowa that the Register may be an exception in this being the biggest newspaper in the state, that many of us have to play a dual role of covering these presidential candidates that they're coming in, but we are still the local media. And let me tell you, the national media will not let you forget that you are the local media at times as well. That when we're there, we do want to ask hard questions. We do want to take advantage of the access that we're giving, but the bulk of our resources is devoted to providing the coverage of our local communities as well. We don't want to. We want, as I said, to take advantage of these opportunities. We want these people to keep coming, and we want to take our moment in the sun to ask the question. But it's also a question that they've been asked many times, and we do have to, I guess, pay attention to what those questions are that aren't being asked. And if we're going to have something new, we have to figure out how to use the most of that opportunity, unlike Kathie, who gets that opportunity much more frequently. So.
With the amount of resources and column inches that we're devoting in the Des Moines Register to this presidential race, I don't know that anybody at the Register would agree that we're not taking it seriously, because sometimes it feels like that's all we do. But I do think that it's a matter of context. Right now in Iowa, you are getting a lot of one side of the issue because the presidential candidates, all the action is on the Republican side. You're getting a lot of rhetoric on the Republican side. The other side is starting to engage, and you're going to start hearing more of a two-sided discussion. But at the same time, you're still trying to cover a race for people who are still trying to decide who they want to nominate as well. There's not a decision point on the Democratic side of who to nominate, and so you do have the the conversation is being dominated really by one party at this point. But that's going to change, and it is going to become more of a question of, is Barack Obama deserving of being reelected versus who exactly is the Republican nominee qualified to be the person to take that place. So it becomes a much broader conversation. It's just that right now during the primary campaign it doesn't seem that way.
I won't repeat a lot of what's said here because I agree with everything you've heard so far. So to add to that, if I could, there are fewer it's a fact that there are fewer reporters now out there, fewer mainstream journalists and what I mean by that is journalists working for mainstream news organizations. There are fewer of them out there developing news and information for things such as wire services, which is what I have to rely on for national, international reporting. But having said that, there are not fewer reporters out there. There are plenty of reporters, and they are digging through these stories. We run into this all the time during not just caucuses, but trial coverage or whatever you're covering a hearing in front of a board where you hear the story roll out, and it rolls out one thing at a time. So the prosecution you hear first, and then the defense in a trial, or at a hearing you hear the allegations and you hear the response. And so what we're hearing is in this process, the process of Republicans vetting their candidates to determine which ones they want to run, and they will select that candidate. The Democrats will have their candidate, and the prohibitively President Obama, and then you're going to see the next stage as this plays out. There's a whole year coming up here to learn this information.
Okay. Another question from the audience? Yes, back there.
Good afternoon. I have actually 3 questions that are kind of related. One is with the folks from the Gazette. I've had your colleague, Jennifer Emerson, I'm not showing up with time to talk to her about it. Be interested in your perspective. Jeff's been on that, and we'll be on next week. You spoke earlier about, in June, I believe it was, changing the function of the comments on the Gazette page to have better accountability. But I noticed subsequent to that, there seems to be some stories that there's a wholesale comments are just entirely turned off. I'm just curious what informed that decision. I don't want to say that it's too polarized, but to prohibit people from speaking at all. Second question, and feel free to jump in. You mentioned about things would come over the transom, so to speak, in the past, and you didn't know whether they were crap or fact. But now we would see them at the same time, I think, because of the democratization of information through the internet. I oftentimes would see stories in all newspapers that then, subsequent to their publication, citizens will find out additional information either about the subject or the person who was interviewed that arguably might have been germane to the story, but didn't make the citizen journalist too terribly wrong. I mean, it comes up online at 8 in the morning, 8:30, someone says, well, hey, what about this, what about that? I'm curious what, if anything, might be keeping your writers from finding that information out ahead of time. And then lastly, in the broadest scheme, do you think that people's tendency to have these debates, often periodically online, is hindered or reduce their willingness or ability to have them in person? With my show, for instance, a number of times I've invited people on to a very vociferous and local press, with letters, but they didn't want to either come and speak in person, or they were willing to, but not if they had the opposing view there. They wanted just their side presented rather than position X, position Y, that's that discussion. They were reluctant. I don't remember that being the case maybe 10, 15 years ago. I think people politically, ideologically willing to speak to one another. Do you think that the rise of the use of the internet for these conversations has diminished people's willingness to do so?
Okay, well, I can take that, that question about the Gazette. We turn off comments on crime stories if it's a fresh crime, and the reason is because we had people commenting about the guilt or innocence of people. We would have people who hadn't gone through the court system, there had been an allegation against them, and we would get comments something like, someone ought to hang the bastard. And we didn't even know if, they hadn't gone through the court system yet. So, and then also, what would happen is there'd be speculation about the crime victim. whether the victim asked for that. And so we don't have comments on crime. We don't have comments on stories that might have something that would be racially sensitive if we think that it'll bring out the racial calls. And here's an example. Crime, here's a real good example. Crime in a neighborhood that is predominantly black. There could be some good discussion going on in that type of story, but we haven't seen it. Instead, we just see accusations about Chicago people. And so we've turned those comments off. And so those are what we turn comments off on. We've had some interesting comment situations. A couple of years ago, the first baby of the year in Lane County was born to a single mother, and the woman took incredible abuse from conservative groups and religious groups about living in sin and how can you celebrate this type of thing. It was very hurtful stuff. So that's what's going on there. Boy, I'm going to do a parry. I forgot one of your questions.
What's keeping writers from finding out all the information?
Yeah. Oh, what's keeping writers from finding out? I can answer that real quickly. It's easier for multiple people to find out multiple stuff than one person to find it out. You find out stuff. You can only find out stuff one thing at a time. And so the interesting thing is, what we think is the paradigm that will work with social media is let's put out what we know and let's have everyone else fill in the story. And our experience is people are saying, how come you don't know the rest of the story? And the reason is we just learn this. We don't know everything all at once, people, but you do know bits and pieces of it. And so instead of saying, hey, here's what I know, we get criticized for not knowing it. Well, you learn things one piece at a time. So what's happening online is you're watching the sausage get made. That's how we learn stuff. So
I would just add to that the process of news gathering, ultimately it ends at a deadline usually for print, and sometimes it ends earlier than that because the reporter has to write 5 different stories. They're maybe not focusing on that one story all day long. And the other thing is that a lot of times reporters do not have the freedom to put everything they know about a story into their report, because even though the internet is infinite, we're putting most of this stuff in the newspaper at some point, and so there are length deadlines as well, or length limits as well. But also I agree with what Lyle says. The other part of it is sometimes there's just the reporter didn't ask that next question. They didn't find the right person. They should have. They missed. There's a public report out there that somebody else knows about that they didn't see, and that's why the reporting should not stop when a story's been in the newspaper. We encourage our reporters to look at the comments. What are people contributing about this topic, and if there's something else that we need to follow up on, we ought to be doing that and paying attention to what people are saying to our story, just as we would if a story appeared in the paper and then somebody called us up the next day and said, well, what about this? We take that as a news tip for a follow-up. And it should be that way with anything that's contributed online as well.
Okay. If I can just add one quick thing. As a reporter, the idea that somebody's going to, 5 minutes after my story hits online, come up with a relevant fact that I miss makes me cringe. I don't want that to happen to me, but I recognize the limitations that Kathie and Lyle spoke about. And I think that as reporters, we need to realize that what we do is an ongoing dialogue and discussion. And I think maybe readers need to understand those limitations as well. Obviously, there's a line to be drawn there. If I just blow it when I'm writing a story and I miss something that's really important, I've not done my job. And so, and there's no amount of laying off of blame on time constraints or length limitations that will excuse that. But that's why I say I cringe at the idea of that happening. But like I said, it is reporting is something that's ongoing, and I think that both the reporters and the readers need to understand it.
Yeah, I think your question is absolutely right, that reporters are increasingly relying on tipsters and citizen watchdogs and people like that who are digging into these things and giving us additional information. But I think that, and a lot of people are aware of that, and I think that there's a sense of resentment among people who are aware of that. They have the idea that you're a professional journalist, I shouldn't have to do this research for you, you should have known this. And I think anyone who's been to a newsroom would know that the majority of the journalists in Iowa aren't slacking off. I think any of us would tell you a 40-hour work week probably has 60 hours of work in it at least. And so it's not as though journalists are lazy and they're missing these things. It's that journalists are facing layoffs, they're facing fewer colleagues, and they're doing more with fewer hours and fewer resources. And that's why it's necessary for citizens to come up with these facts. And I think to some extent, citizens should embrace that. To not have to go to journalism school, to not have to get a job for Gazette, to not have to do all of these things, but still be able to further public discussion is something that I think a lot of people ought to be excited about, to be able to participate in the creation of journalism.
And it also is, it's the type of tips that have been going on for a long time. It's just, as everything else about the new media environment, it's just happening in a lot more in real time and focused on. If they are signed comments, if people are upfront about who they are and they're constantly giving good information on comments and adding to stories, good reporters, good editorial writers and other things will start to contact those people before a story goes into print and start to say, I'm talking about this topic, what do you know about this, or do you have any suggestions, as they would, and just add them to the sources. The problem is that many of those are right now coming from online or from anonymous sources, so it's hard to judge whether they're a credible source or how to even go about getting them, and sometimes, or even how to get a message to them ahead of time saying, I've got a story on this, I'd be very interested in what you have to say.
You had asked about also face-to-face.
All this online stuff taking people's thunder away, or really just trying to have this kind of discussion.
For many it has, and in the Gazette, one of the policies that we instituted in June was you have to use your real name, and we still have people getting in, fake names, and I just caught one today, and I had an interesting conversation with someone. They said they don't want to use their real name because they own a business, and if their comments were tied to their business, they'd have problems with their customers, and so this person wanted to use a pseudonym instead so that the words wouldn't stick to him and his business. And I said, but that's not accountability. And so we're seeing how that works. I can tell you that it's still flawed. We still have people using fake names. It has diminished some of the conversation, and it also has brought out people who actually like the idea of their name being attached to the flame throwing that they do. And it's also subjected some people to attacks, so it's not perfect.
I think that we also need to realize that the reluctance to speak face-to-face is not a political issue. I think, being a young person, being an undergrad, I'm 21 years old, most of my friends are much more likely to text me or chat me online than to call me or ask to meet face-to-face, whether it's about politics or not, no matter what it is. I think young people especially are more likely to want to talk in a digital setting.
I do think that people are less willing to speak face-to-face, and I don't necessarily blame the media for that. It's also I think a function of the fact that our discourse can be a lot less civil, and people are afraid to engage in something that might end up being sort of a hostile confrontation. What people don't realize is that face-to-face discourse almost always ends up being more civil, not less. And when you end up talking to people face-to-face and you can see their body language, suddenly they may not be quite so threatening, or something that they're saying has the context so it doesn't seem quite so offensive. A lot of times, I do get lots of really over-the-top responses to some of the things I write. And one thing I find is that when I respond back to the person, the second email from that person is often a lot more civil, because they realize that they are communicating suddenly with a real person and not just a name online. And so, I commend you for trying to encourage people, especially of different political persuasions, to get into a room with each other. And, you know, Senator Tinsman, I mean, you remember probably how things were in the legislature where people of different parties actually socialized with each other. I don't know that that happens enough anymore. And building those relationships do go a long way toward actually being able to find ways to get things done that go beyond just, you know, party line votes. So I do commend you for trying to do that, and I hope you'll continue to try.
I think Kathie's point is really interesting, that when people talk to each other in person, they're much more civil to each other. I think a good example of that is whenever Bob Vanderplatz holds an event, almost without fail, there's some heckler, some dissenter who wants to yell something or ask a question in a very curt manner. And instead of, you know, telling them to hush or having someone escort them out, Bob Vanderplatz always gives them a chance to talk. And then they find that they're not so fiery about it, that they have a reasonable question to make. And both sides, I think, end up having a lot more respect for one another, regardless of their political feelings.
I think I am going to throw in my third question, particularly because it relates to a panel earlier today on women in political discourse. Then hopefully we'll have time for one more question for the audience for kind of a short answer. A lot of research, as you well know, shows that media cover men and women political candidates differently. That goes back into time from probably the earlier studies in the 1980s, certainly through about the 1998 to 1999 election. And now what my research and others' research are showing is that the coverage of male and female candidates, particularly by newspapers, is much more equitable for women running for U.S. Senate and governor. But what we've seen is it's inequitable when a woman runs for president or vice president. Certainly we saw studies of that, of Hillary Clinton in 2008, Sarah Palin in 2008, and now me and one of my colleagues from Iowa State University are studying Michelle Bachmann. You know, I will say, because one of the questions I always get is that, of course, when Michelle Bachmann or Sarah Palin or Hillary Clinton makes a campaign gaffe, that should be covered. So what we try to do in our research is that we have what we consider substantive negative coverage and personal negative coverage. And what we found with Clinton, Palin, and I don't know what we'll find with Bachmann, is that they were covered more in terms, much more than their male opponents in personal negative coverage. I think someone gave an example today with Sarah Palin, people even wondering why she should be a presidential candidate or vice presidential candidate when she had 5 children, including special needs children, questioning their motherhood and things like that. There's been stories on Michelle Bachmann's eyelashes in a number of cases. But so the substantive coverage and then the personal coverage is also very negative. What we also found with Hillary Clinton is that she was covered much more in terms of her image than issues. So my question, after stating all that, what the research shows, is that in your news organizations, do you make any kind of when you have a female candidate running against men, do you have any kind of sensitivity to that in your coverage so that you try to watch out for kind of those gender traps that basically are covering women in terms of image and men more in terms of issues?
I think you're absolutely right that the media treats women unfairly, and I think evidence of that is that when news broke that Michelle Bachmann gets migraines occasionally, it was a big story. ABC really blew it up. A lot of news organizations covered it. And there have been hardly any stories about the fact that Ron Paul is super old. That could he survive until the end of his first term? That's a serious question. And few in the media are asking that, but everyone is really excited about Michelle Bachmann's migraines, and they made a big story out of that. And so you're absolutely right that women are covered unfairly. We try to stay away from those issues altogether. The national media is going to take care of, if there are health issues, serious health issues that would prevent a president from operating, the national media is going to pick up on those. And so we try to stay away from those personal things altogether and just cover their proposals and what their proposals would do. And so that's kind of our safety from providing any sexist coverage.
I don't know that we have necessarily any guidelines, but I will say that for every one story about Michelle Bachmann's eyelashes, there have been 50 stories about Mitt Romney's hair, So, I don't think it's necessarily, neither of these things are particularly substantive, right? But they do a lot of times go to how voters perceive a candidate. And when you're talking about retail politics, you're talking about candidates being able to make personal connections with voters, and things like Mitt Romney being, too slick and having perfect hair. That was something that voters responded to 4 years ago. And now, 4 years later, when Mitt Romney comes to Iowa, what does he wear? He wears blue jeans and no tie, and he, it's a clear, I think that these are things that are legitimate things to comment on in a news story, because it goes toward how a candidate is presenting themselves in a personal way to voters. Now, Michelle Bachmann's migraines versus Ron Paul being very old. I think that the bias there was toward Ron Paul because people perceived him as perhaps not being a serious candidate. He should be offended that there's not more stories about how he's really old. And I do think that, along that same level, Herman Cain, there were a lot of news stories about him talking about his past experience with cancer on the campaign trail. And if he manages to continue despite other negative coverage of personal issues in his life, if he continues at the top of the polls, I suspect that there will be more discussion about, the importance of his vice presidential choice, the relative importance, because he's a cancer survivor.
We don't have any guidelines we don't really talk about it. I see things on the national level that make me cringe, but we try to do our best to cover fairly just on issues and ability to connect for all female high office holders in Iowa up to the lieutenant governor's office.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, our paper is much like Lyle's, and I think that we don't have guidelines, but by the very nature of a limited number of reporters, covering politics beyond the local level. I'm serious about that. I spend my time trying to write about more substantive things rather than the things that you're talking about. But that's a double-edged sword too, because when you're only writing about issues, you might be missing some of those things that people are legitimately interested in, that come close to that line of whether you're writing about something that's substantively fluff or non-substantively fluff. So it is a double-edged sword. But I think for us it's not been a problem. We don't write about Michelle Bachmann's eyelashes.
Good.
Since we are at the University of Iowa, there's lots of analysis of our news coverage, and some people have pointed out tropes and other things that they would consider questionable. As I've read through some of them are substantive, that reporters sometimes fall back, not necessarily on old stereotypes, but old narratives, that they find the quickest way to write a story, and some of it might be an older one, and it brings out some sexist notion that's not necessarily analyzed, not intentional on the reporter's part, but all of a sudden when you read it afterwards, perhaps that is something there. But it's hard to, when I read these studies or read these people who are writing, it's hard to compare it. Again, Michelle Bachmann's eyelashes versus Mitt Romney's hair. Every time that you focus on these things, it's not necessarily gendered specific as much as our politics are very externally oriented, and we talk about all of these things. I will say that, so when a credible critique is brought to us, we consider it and we look at it, but no, we don't have a hard and fast policy for that. I will say for letters to the editor, however, I, depending on the candidate, have had to edit out a lot of overtly misogynistic language from letters to the editor and other things in a way that I was somewhat surprised to be getting in letters in the 21st century as well. So.
Well, we have,
I was just going to say one other thing. Frankly, I was glad to hear that on the when you look at the offices below the president, that
yes.
That it was more equitable, because those are the offices that we most write about. When it comes to congressional Senate offices, covered a lot of women candidates, and there has been the opportunity to write stories that might fit into that category you're talking about, because they're basically local stories that nobody else is covering. So I'm happy to hear that.
And I guess good for me that now that there is inequitable news coverage at the higher level, it gives me more to study, I guess. So you got to find differences. We have 4 minutes left. So if anybody has a question that they think can be answered very briefly, yes, no, or just by one or two of the panelists, let me know. So I need, okay, there.
You had touched on the issue of anonymous speech. You said you making people use their real names now. And that's kind of an issue, a First Amendment issue that's been going on for a long time. What is the value of anonymous political speech? And it's evolved with the new media, social media. And I wonder if one or two of you could speak to the good and the bad of that. And you have more voices in the conversation, but there is a lack of accountability. How do you balance that?
And now we just have a couple minutes. So do one or two want to just take it?
I didn't take a swing at this before, and the Register has struggled with our comment section and how the same way the Gazette has gone through different ways of trying to encourage some accountability. We had first we tried having commenters basically police each other, and they could report comments that didn't meet our standards of civility. And ultimately, our latest thing is that we require people to sign in through Facebook because we think that Facebook is a little bit easier to track who the people are, although it's not a perfect thing. I think that anonymous speech is always going to be with us. I think the question we have to ask as media organizations is, do we have to be the forum for it? And how does that affect the credibility of our news product? I think that in some cases comments make that product more credible because to the extent that you have a conversation with people, the writers are more, if they're more transparent, it can make your news organization more credible. On the other hand, if you have a story where you're just allowing people to put hate speech at the end of something that you've written and you just scroll down and suddenly the hate speech starts, I think that it can actually make your reporting less credible. So, we're all struggling with this, and I just think that for our interests as a news organization, we want responsible discussion. Typically speaking, non-anonymous discussion tends to be more responsible and accountable, and that's the thing we want to encourage.
We've done actually market research and some focus groups that lead us to believe that the credibility of our stories has been hampered by the comments because people take them as something we endorse. I've suggested to some commenters that they're guests on our site and they scoff at it. And I think part of the reason is because we've opened up ourselves to saying we want to know what the community is saying, and we've but we still are considered a quasi-government, the public rules kind of entity. But the fact is, we still are entities that are trying to give news and information, and we do control our sites.
Well, we've run out of time. I thank the panelists because taking time out of their busy schedule covering politics in Iowa for coming to Iowa City today and be part of this panel. So let's give them all a big round of applause.
And just to briefly wrap up, I really want to thank all of the panelists we've had over these 2 days and all the speakers and the people that have traveled from around the country or given up time out of their jobs to be here. I really want to thank all of you who have taken time out of your day, care enough about this issue to be able to do this and come down. And I'd like to just very briefly again remind you all of the people that helped sponsor the event, including the Public Policy Center in our Fork and Brock series, but UI Student Government, the Office of the Vice President for Research, the Office of the Provost, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Law, College of Education, College of Public Health, the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, Department of Sociology, the Sudhindra Bose Lecture Series of the Department of Political Science, the Department of Communication Studies, the Iowa Women's Archive, the UI Libraries, the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum, the University Lecture Committee, the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies, the Center for Human Rights, all of the news organizations that we have here, the Johnson County League of Women Voters, the UI College Republicans, the Iowa Democratic Party, the Republican Party of Iowa, the UI Digital Studio for the Public Humanities and School of Art and Art History, the UI Institute for Cinema and Culture, the Iowa City Chamber of Commerce, No Labels, the Johnson County Community for Successful Aging and PATV. And I wanted to just reinforce that, I think, to reinforce how important this issue is, that all of these groups were willing to associate their name with this in one way or another. And if we can, in some small way, have raised this issue one more time, it's not the first time, it certainly won't be the last time, but with the Iowa caucuses here, and hopefully with the events, but then everything that's been going on and all of these, everything that's been captured here over these 2 days will be put up on our website and be available to people. So thank you all very much, and I think it's been a very successful 2 days.